Some of you may have encountered and came across that the notion that one can realize one's essential nature just like a matter of something simply coming to one's fullness of understanding, fullness of awareness, and that becomes a matter of fact. In other words, this whole other energetic aspect, the gamut of transformation, became or fall on the background. In fact, many people here are associated and come from the yogic tradition. Many people here in this room, or quite few of you, I know, as a matter of fact, teachers of yoga in your own right, in your own way, trained at least facilitators of yoga. Some of you are yoga teachers in many, many years, or enthusiasts of yoga at least, to say the least. And the view that became more dominant as the years went by, that this whole yogic tradition is a kind of like an anachronistic, outlived, or if you want to do it, it's up to you. If you don't worry about that. As long as you understand that there is a shortcut, there is a direct path. In fact, it is often packaged and presented as a direct path to self-realization. That path of self-inquiry with the chief or chieftains of that tradition, with some key figures who are undoubtedly the greatest examples of what self-realization presents itself, of what self-realization in terms of the human capacity stands for. So this notion was born that this kind of work that happens in this kind of container, it's a simply optional, if people are more tolerant, or they would simply consider it as applicational or alternative. If people are a bit more, let's say, unapologetic in their perspectives, then they will simply dismiss it as a waste of time, because you can simply realize yourself on the account of the fact that if you apply sincerely and accurately and persistently enough that pressing question, who is behind the one who is seeking? Who is the one to whom all this happens? To whom these ideas come? Who is the witness of this experience? Then this will suffice for, at some point, simply abiding as the self. And all this will become simply irrelevant, simply unnecessary, simply a waste of time. Before you begin to get disappointed and kind of like, I booked myself a wrong retreat for this weekend. I want to bring this to your understanding and your awareness. And you are not to put a point here, but rather a comma for your further insights and investigations into this interesting phenomena on your own. Because what I'd like to suggest, with direct references to those key figures who stand as unquestionable examples, as well as the key teachers who are there constantly being referred to. If you come from that lineage of so-and-so, then the mark of excellence will be with reference to Ramana Maharshi's teaching. So if there's any question with regard to the validity of the teacher who teaches you, whether he is from Arizona, California, England, France, Germany, or Italy, the reference will be immediately to that unquestionable etalon. Is there a term in German? Etalon? Example, like etalon of gold. It's the purest composition. Okay, sample, example. Let's settle on that. So I would refer you to precisely that example. The example of someone like Ramana Maharshi, who, when he was questioned about the place and the role of that, what the energy of transformation is known for, and there is a term in the Indian subcontinent, which most of you are aware and have heard in different contexts, known as Kundalini. What is this and how that Kundalini relates to this whole process? His reply was very short. Kundalini is nothing other than the self. It is the self in its individualized form. And the practice of self-inquiry is to awaken that Kundalini. And he gave that famous analogy that the yogi would do it through the breath, and the jnani would do it through self-inquiry. But both will awaken the force that is in dormancy, and that force will rise through the middle pathway. It will rise through that formidable link, through that formidable passage. There was no speculations left, nothing. Once that takes place, the journey of awakening really begins. And this aspect is simply overseen, overlooked, and became, I don't know, somehow oblivious to in the world of Neo-Advaita, in non-duality circles. And this generated and still generates battalions of armies of people who are confused on the path of self-realization, because there is assumption that one can end up in the kingdom of heaven just by reading a book persistently enough and applying the understanding, just by attending the satsang with the teacher, listening to what teacher says, what he points to, and eventually realizing that. Whereas the key exponents of these teachings were very adamant about it. And they laid these questions aside when they made it very clear that self-inquiry is not leading to enlightenment. It's leading to the awakening of life force. Just as all yogic practices, therefore all tantric practices, are aimed at that, at the activation and awakening of that what otherwise in dormancy. And if you put two and two together, that Kundalini is that self. It's the self in its state of homeostasis, the self in a state of dormancy. That's what creates the notion of me. That's what creates the notion of this temporal individual being, that soul, that jiva, that whatever you want to call it. It's simply consciousness willingly accepts this crystallized, temporal, very fleeting identity. Because obviously we all have a little bit of cosmogony and cosmology in our view and perspective. I'm sure the most kind of busy of us who live in what life imposes on us on a daily basis still have a bigger perspective, that our life is very short. I'm sure about that. It's not that I'm 50-something and then you are maybe 20-something, that you don't have that notion. I had that notion when I was in my 20s, that life is a fleeting affair. It's not going to be here forever in terms of this body. So obviously that kind of coagulated, crystallized consciousness cannot be here viewed as an eternal perspective. So it's just a temporal something. It's like a blink of an eye. It's like a yawn from the perspective of awareness, from the perspective of eternity. This is nothing but that, a blink of an eye. So how can a blink of an eye be seen as a predicament for awareness? Obviously it does not. Therefore, many spiritual traditions took that stand as well. That this whole avidya, this whole ignorance, this whole calamity is also seen as just that temporal hallucination, temporal eclipse, some kind of like something that turned itself into a predicament. These are philosophical perspectives, of course, grand perspectives, which are very helpful, and not all of us are capable of holding this in our awareness at all times. Life takes us over, and rightly so, because as It is said that we are all different and differently even wired slightly, so not all of us have this capacity to see things from that perspective. There are other perspectives that are equally valid. Also the perspective where that wave of compassion comes when we realize that in that temporal blink of an eye, that blink of an eye is our life. It may be from the perspective of cosmos and the relativity of time and space, it seems like just a fleeting moment. For ourselves, it's alive. It's culture, it's civilization. It's parents and children, grandchildren, brothers and sisters, wives and husbands, friends, dear ones. It's the life as we know it. And in this life as we know it, it suddenly becomes an important affair. So therefore, spiritual teachings vary. And therefore, methodologies vary. Therefore, there are more, if you will, humanistic perspectives when it comes to this philosophical understanding of who we are and what we are doing here as earthlings on this planet. So again, going back to where we have started, where I wanted to draw your attention to, is to whether this is at all an alternative, just as kind of like, if not subordinate path, why to go through the ordeal. I want this to be clearly understood and without anything taken for granted, is that psychophysiological transformation of consciousness is not an alternative perspective. It's a bias which became a collective bias in the modern spirituality to think that it's an alternative path, that there's somehow a cleaner, purer, less messy path. It's like giving birth. I often give this example because it's also something I have witnessed, second-hand, but have witnessed. Obviously, I was not given that privilege or option to give or go through the experience of childbirth, but I've witnessed it firsthand. And it's a messy process. The birth of a new life is a messy process. Of course, we can fantasize that this can become a very clinical affair. And we can even present it, and maybe even can sedate ourselves, right? Everything can be done in a clinical way, indeed. But the childbirth, in normal majority of cases, it's a messy process, is it not? So the birth of consciousness, or rebirthing of consciousness, is very much an analogy that is helpful to understand what it is like. Why? And this is where is the crux of the matter. Is because our mind and our physiology are inseparable. In fact, it's the first predicament that we need to overcome as the culture. In other words, it's no longer even enough to say mind-body medicine. It's no longer enough to speak of mind and body as one affecting the other, because this is also spoken of in that way. In fact, there is no way we can peel where the body is and where the mind is. This is the next frontier, and that frontier has already been crossed. This is the cutting edge. It's the avant-garde of today's scientific investigations in the field of neurophysiology. And this is where we came full circle and re-evaluating these ancient methodologies. And Tantra is that. Therefore, Tantra has viewed human body, including all its physiological functioning, or if you want, including all its neurophysiological functioning, as that doorway to heaven. In Tantric spirituality, every biological process in the body is not to be dismissed or even transcended to see through, but to be gradually purified, because the body is not seen here neither as a predicament nor as a nuisance, but as the very, very consciousness itself. So in other words, cellular structure here cannot be viewed from the mechanical perspective of that, let's say, sometimes spoken of as Newtonian physics, as just some kind of orchestrated machinery. No, it's intelligence, pure intelligence in motion. It's pure intelligence in motion. Even our cellular structure, that what we call matter, in this case, from tantric perspective, is spoken of as nothing other than awareness. This is one of the first tenets of the platform which has been chosen very carefully to become the very cornerstones of the teachings that we can lean on. And from the perspective of Kashmir Shaivism, with the key scriptural works that stand as the birthing, if you will, grounds upon which the whole tantric wisdom would grow and thrive, rests on that very understanding that nothing exists that is not Shiva, nothing exists that is not awareness. And that understanding immediately brings this repositioning that this is indeed not a reflection in awareness, not somehow a kind of epiphenomenon that perceivable through the apertures, the organs of cognition, which are here at the mercy or for the purpose of the sensory perception, but the very, very awareness itself. So in other words, body here is seen in a very different light. Body is not seen here as an opposition in any way, or maya, or kind of illusion, or hallucination, or anything other than awareness itself. But the work consists in that transformation, in that alchemical transformation of all its components, where that understanding simply becomes one's lived reality. It is no longer something to think about or even to check oneself. When one wakes up in the morning, one doesn't need to remind oneself any longer. It no longer requires any mental or intellectual activity. It becomes just, if you will, as they say it again, it's an English idiom, second nature. It's just like, let's say, a man no longer questions his gender, and I'm not talking about the cases of the transgender, and I'm not talking about kind of lost identity of, like, you know, woman trapped in the male body or man trapped in the female body. I'm just talking about this very simple affair that when you wake up in the morning, do you need to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm a woman, I am. Okay, that's good, okay. Oh, I'm a man, I slept so deep I kind of forgot who I was. No, that's not required. Kind of like you grew up with that understanding, and that understanding, you kind of like, it no longer requires any confirmation whatsoever. It is the same with the process of this transformation, which leads naturally to that what becomes one's second nature. And yet, this transformational process is inseparable from the freeing of the nervous system from anything that stands on the way of that recognition. So in other words, this full circle, is there a way to realize your essence, to realize the essence of who we are through alternative ways, or can psychophysiological transformation of consciousness can be seen as just unique to Tantra, and there are other methodologies? It is for you to find out, for you to look into. It's your homework. You need to find out. Because the purpose of this kind of container, the purpose of this kind of workshop is to orient you and give you direct sense, direct taste of what this work is like.